GX, but we're high energy, we're raring to go. Yeah, you all look like you're super energetic, right? Give me a woo. There you go.
That was actually better than I was expecting.
That was a pretty good woo.
Well done.
That was a good woo. My name is Alice Bauer from Rock Paper Shotgun, and I'm joined today by Ian and Paul from Mode 7 Games, and we're going to talk about the making of Frozen Synapse 2, which excitingly came out a fortnight?
Week and a half
ago. Yeah.
And isn't really finished being made yet.
Don't say that.
But when it is, I'll tell you.
I was going to say that you are right now working on the OS X versions. And
That's right. We're going to have the Mac and Linux versions out next week, I think.
Yeah.
And still patching, fixing a couple of problems and adding new stuff. We're going to be adding loads of new stuff in the next 4 months. It's a massive game, but we're going to keep doing things to it.
Yes, I want to just say quickly to our community and everyone here, Ian has been working insanely hard since we launched on Problems. This is the first break you've had, really, to come here and do this.
Yeah, it's the first 2 days in a row that I haven't been at the code base. We managed to launch a really good patch on Friday, and
yeah.
I feel relaxed.
That's
you feel good.
That's a good thing, trust me.
Extra thank you for being here with us today as well. Does everyone in the audience, everyone know about, did you play Frozen Synapse? You did.
Oh, that's awesome.
A lot of nods. That's great.
Oh,
yeah, nice. But do you want to maybe do the kind of the elevator pitch for Frozen Synapse 2, just in case anyone watching at home?
Do you want me to
I'll rock, paper, scissors, you not do it.
Okay.
1, 2, 3. Damn it. Okay, so on the top level, Frozen Synapse is the game of being the fat guy in the truck in a Hollywood movie who's telling the SWAT guys what to do. You have a top-down viewpoint, and you are giving your 4 SWAT guys generally plans for what to do in the next 5 seconds. Your opponent is doing the same, and then those 2 plans play out together. So it kind of takes the best of real-time and turn-based design, because you get as long as you want to decide what you're going to do, but it plays out in real time so you can still sort of trick your opponent, do things that are unexpected. And what's really nice is that you can be doing your turn at 8 in the evening, your brother in Australia can be doing his at 3 in the morning, and then when you get up in the morning, you've got his turn to see, and then you can play your next turn. It sort of feels really nice.
Yep, and then Frozen Synapse 2 was taking that kind of core gameplay and then adding to it a massive strategic layer set in a big procedurally generated city with lots of AI factions and things like that. So it was taking your kernel, your core, your nugget, and then growing it into a beautiful
big nugget.
There you go.
So Frozen Synapse 2, I really loved XCOM Apocalypse, which was the 3rd XCOM game, and it was set in a city with a lot of crazy factions, although they didn't end up having time to actually sort of really make the factions feel alive, and that's sort of something that we've done, is make a city with some pretty crazy guys running around, and you have to balance keeping them happy with dealing with an existential threat to the city.
Yes, a good review quote was, "It's like running a cyberpunk Uber Eats," which I thought was pretty nice.
That's a pretty good quote. So Frozen Synapse came out in 2011. Obviously, tons of awards, did really well. Congratulations.
Thank
7
you.
years after the fact for that. How soon after that happening did you start thinking about Frozen Synapse 2?
Well, pretty much it wasn't on my radar for a few years, because I felt I'd really sort of nailed the concept of the main gameplay in Frozen Synapse 1. But then I spent 3 years making Frozen Cortex, which was awesome and really quite different, despite being the same genre in some ways. And I realized that you could take this really, really great tactical combat, and you could put it in something really interesting from an overarching meta map kind of thing. Because often games that have really awesome map gameplay have slightly boring or slightly superfluous actual combat. And I thought the idea of doing both amazingly was a really good one.
Fair enough. And I should say as well that Mode 7 is a small core team, right? Are you 50% of the core team, or are you?
Effectively.
In value, certainly.
Wow.
Didn't mean
It's
that.
going to be fun on Monday.
So myself and Paul, we have 2 other programmers, an artist and level designer / assistant designer called Robin, who is very, very awesome.
That's good. So how with a project like this, then how do you divide that up between you with such a small team?
I mean, so basically, even with a small team with such a big game, the hold-ups are still pretty much always to do with iterating on design aspects. It's a very, very featureful game, but if you didn't have to spend sometimes months at a time working out what works and obviously more usually working out what doesn't work, you would be able to get things done in time. Because if you knew what the game was going to be, you could just give all the tasks out and it would be a bit quicker. So I think the most important thing is keeping the pipeline full. While I'm struggling trying to work out how to make the game more fun and work out why this bit isn't working, making sure that other people are working on the bits of the game that they still can get through, that isn't going to be immediately undermined by part of the game changing.
Yeah, so we're kind of structured around you in terms of Ian is the one who has the vision for the game and does the core design and does the lion's share of the programming, with sort of secondary programming tasks going elsewhere. And like you say, that puts the sort of the pressure, the focus on you to kind of.
That's right, and it's of all the things that I do, I think what I do best might be the slightly boring thing of project management. I just tend to have a pretty good picture in my head of what needs to happen in a larger scale and what things are going to hold us up and what things are going to take an unexpected amount of time. So it's not very interesting, but that's what it takes to finish games.
I mean, that's fair enough again. You mentioned being kind of inspired by XCOM. Was it always you knew you wanted to do a cityscape like quite early on, you want to add that, or were there iterations of different ideas for that?
Well, I think that the most important aspect of actually was a game called Abomination: The Nemesis Project, which was a really, really cool, like, top-down, clicky shooter thing, like action RPG, maybe you'd call it. And it just had this, it was just really, really fun. It was so much loot, but the city map was just a picture of a city, and with just like random pins in it, and it just so undermined it for me, and I really wanted it to be more like XCOM in that way. So that sort of was like made me realize how important that stuff was to me as a player. Amazing combat, but then something that feels really meaningful on the upside. And then I also was just a huge fan of Alpha Centauri, because the factions in Alpha Centauri, they felt like real weirdos, and I had very emotional responses to all of them. And I wanted to make the player feel that. Like, I felt like I was playing in a room full of these absolute idiots when I was playing single player Alpha Centauri. And I really wanted to have that in Frozen Synapse. So that's really what drove me to do that.
I'd forgotten about Abomination, the Nemesis Project.
How could you forget about Abomination, the Nemesis Project?
When we finish a game, we need to do this so I can remember like all the things you say. So when I'm asked about it, like, right, I'm gonna put that one in.
I'm very happy. I'll work on a freelance basis. Just come and interview in your office.
Please do. That'd be great.
Mediation.
Yeah. I mean, mentioning that there are obviously factions in this one as well, and there's kind of what I think is really nice is this kind of broader contextual kind of story that your actions and your skirmishes and stuff are placed in, that you see glimpses of as you're playing. Do you guys, is there, J.K. Rowling says like, oh yeah, I know what happens to all the characters. Do you have a kind of big map of like everyone's stories and?
No, and it's not as.
And neither does J.K. Rowling.
It's not as impressive. Yeah, that's true. Not as impressive as it sounds. I mean, I certainly wanted to getting the balance of how enigmatic the factions are versus kind of how explicit what they're doing is and how they express themselves is pretty difficult. And with Frozen Cortex, we kind of went into quite a lot of detail on all the different teams, and there was a lot of kind of deeper interaction there. And there was some comments that people kind of wanted it to be left more mysterious. People vary so much with lore and their love or distaste for lore. Some people want to know everything, like, but what does he have for breakfast? Like, why didn't he tell me that? And other people are just like, no, this is boring. Like, I don't want to. So trying to keep that flow of information into the game in terms of backstories is really hard. I mean, I don't think I've managed to achieve like the balance that I want yet. So with future games and maybe sort of the updates that we do for this, I might want to tweak that around a bit. But yeah, we did. It was important to me to have a core single-player story. I mean, that kind of came in really late because we were thinking of keeping it very, very open gameplay, and then we decided to have a linear sequence of missions. So we do have that linear story in there, and hopefully the idea is that as you follow along through that, you'll kind of find out more about the world that will plug back into all of the factions. So it's with a game of this scope, with this much going on, where the player can also basically determine what they do. I mean, you can literally walk up to your boss's office and shoot them at the start of the game and end the story. And the game can cope with that. So it's a big, challenging mess, and I'm never sure if it's successful or not.
That's really interesting. I didn't know you could do that.
You can literally do that.
Go and try that now.
Yep.
The other thing, I mean, you mentioned Cyberpunk as well. Cyberpunk is maybe a bit of it's the flavor of the moment right now.
Yep.
But you guys were clearly into it before it was cool. And I just wondered, because there's kind of a discussion about, what is Cyberpunk and what is authentic Cyberpunk. What you guys feel is what you like about Cyberpunk as kind of an idea, as a genre, and what you think is most interesting about it?
I think the thing for me, so the two major touchstones for this, and the first one were Neuromancer, which is the obvious kind of cliched one, and Ghost in the Shell standalone complex specifically. And the things that really drew me to those are this idea of abstraction of systems. So you have a city, or in Neuromancer, sort of several locations, and then it's the idea of these complex interleaved systems operating both above and below of that. So something that's really powerful in Neuromancer is the idea of the sort of the biz, the street transactions being part of a network that's also connected to kind of the high-level tech and the high-level AI. And that was something that I kind of tried to explore a bit in FS1, but that was more of a linear campaign, and it was a little bit more character-driven. And in this, I really wanted to feel like you have... So Ian's designed these kind of tiered gameplay systems, and narratively, I wanted to tie them together and make it feel like when your squad goes to a position on the street, that has some kind of network implication, which also feeds into the secondary network of all the factions. So yeah, layers and abstractions of systems, I think, is really core to Cyberpunk, and also how identity, personal identity, social identity relates to that structure.
I think Cyberpunk is about living in a sort of a decaying world, a world that is past its peak, and I find that really interesting. Just as a consumer of it, like reader of Gibson's stuff, I think it's a really romantic idea in some ways, because we're always moving forward technologically in our real lives, and the idea of us being past that peak and just having all of this older stuff breaking down around us, something I find quite evocative.
That's probably why people feel like it's relevant to contemporary society, because we are seeing that, structures breaking down, political and technological, and that probably explains some of the resurgence of interest in it, kind of like how there's loads of horror movies every time there's a Republican government in the US. Like maybe there's some political cycle that happens that brings Cyberpunk back, which is good for fans of Cyberpunk, but perhaps not good for fans of stable income.
One thing I did want to ask as well, which is probably a question more for you, Ian. I get when it's multiplayer and you're playing against a person, obviously you're playing against all the things that they could think of, and I guess maybe if you know them well, it's easier to predict what they might do. Mm-hmm. How do you balance in the single player? How do you balance the AI so that it's not too silly and sort of stupid, but not too much smarter than the player?
Yes, Ian. How do you do that?
I'll let you know when I find out how. The key thing for a game like this is the AI has to be competent first. It's always easier to make an AI worse or maybe not funner. That's like a different issue. But with a game that's so much about working out the possibilities and predicting what your opponent's going to do, and that's really the fundamental of Frozen Synapse, the AI has to be quite good. Luckily, so with Frozen Cortex, the AI had to literally be basically perfect for the game not to be completely undermined. Whereas in Frozen Synapse, which is a game about sending guys in with guns and where are you going to cover, and it has a lot more role play to it, it doesn't have to be quite as good because you're still trying to clear a building, and there's a lot of fun in just doing that competently. So you don't have to have an AI where you're sort of genuinely completely unsure what it's going to do. But the most important thing I did in the AI was in FS1, if a unit was really screwed and knew it was screwed, it would sort of hide, and that was boring gameplay. So in FS2, I just put in this thing called Rambo mode, which is when it works out that it's going to die anyway, it just runs out shooting, which is much funner to play
it is
and takes less time.
It's really interesting for me. So I'm not a coder, so I just get to observe sort of certain things Ian does with ore. And it's really interesting for me how different the AI in FS1 is to FS2. In FS1, it kind of feels a bit more like it's kind of like a game director sort of Doom-style thing that's throwing enemies at you, and you have to just kind of think about where they're going to come from, set up your defenses, and then you're going to do it okay. In FS2, it feels like playing a person who has a really specific play style where they're really careful about anticipating you, but they're quite easy to double bluff. So
right.
That's the sensation for me.
That is how the AI works, actually.
Oh, cool. Well, it kind of comes through. So it makes for a really different play experience. Like you're actually trying to sort of psych out the AI more in FS2. And I don't know kind of FS1's more relaxing to play for that reason.
Right.
But I think, I mean, the AI in FS2 just feels better and more sophisticated and more sort of like you're really using your strategic mind for it.
You know, this is really one of the tough things about making single player for a very competitive tactical multiplayer game, which is that it's so much of what's good about single player is kind of half knowing what you're supposed to do, which is like the exact opposite. If you're playing chess or bridge or poker or like a real sort of proper competitive game, you have no rules really, because your opponent's just as intelligent as you and has all the same tools as you. Trying to balance that correctly in a single-player version of a multiplayer game is actually really, really tough, because it's just very hard and stressful to play like that the whole time, and it puts a huge amount of onus on AI to be great as well. So it's kind of trying to mix those two things correctly is something that I'm still trying to get completely right.
I mean, it is, whether you're playing against an AI or a person, it's difficult. It's tense, and it's an intense game, and like in a good way, I should say. I'm not complaining, but I mean, was there ever a worry? I guess you knew that there was kind of an appetite for that sort of game from the success of Frozen Synapse. But there's been a lot of talk with the release of games about Cuphead and stuff like that games that are difficult, about like maybe how difficult is too difficult, or you know, are there extremes of like too easy and too difficult? Was there ever a worry that there wouldn't be an appetite for that?
I think we've always been kind of unafraid of making games that people can bounce off if they find them strategically too complex. I don't think we're not sort of, we've never focused on almost that sort of Blizzard direction of how can I make the ramp as easy as possible. I think we've always tried to go away from that.
I think that the real key is that it's either worrying about that, and this is my issue, not Paul's. It's just the opposite way to which I design things. It's not. I find it so hard to think about. Me and Paul butt heads about user interface all the time, because it's the first thing Paul wants to get right, and it's the last thing that I want to get right, because I'm thinking about the end experience and trying to think about what it's like once you are good at this game, which in some ways is an absolutely terrible way to sell any kind of video game, but is unfortunately the way that I think. So when it comes to was I worried about it? It just wasn't a thing I ever really thought about, because I can play Frozen Synapse, and the people that I know can play Frozen Synapse, but it's still it is jarring when the game is released and you see some people who just think that you've made like something in Japanese.
I think you just can't have both. Like you can't. There is no way that a company that was sort of more predicated around that very generalized approach of trying to make every new player have an amazing first experience. You can't have that. I mean, just look at something like StarCraft 2, which is sort of the closest Blizzard game to our games. That's brutally difficult to learn multiplayer at sort of initial level, whereas maybe something like a MOBA is easier, and that's perhaps why those games have sort of taken off in advance of some of those other multiplayer titles. So in order to have games like this, you're going to have a bit of a learning curve, and then, so my job is kind of to take what Ian's done and then try and mitigate that as much as possible, you know, try and do tutorialization as much as possible. Yeah, it is. But I just think, like, it's not, there is this idea that sort of every game shouldn't have a tutorial and every game should be equally sort of accessible at the low end, and it just can't happen with certain kinds of design, and it just happens to be where your design laser is pointed.
Yeah, because it isn't just the interface; it's about what the experience of playing it is like as well. You know, if it's Hearthstone and it's a nice linear series of decisions that you're making, that's actually possible to make into something that's really easy to get into, and some things aren't.
I think it's interesting at the moment that we're seeing some, for want of a better term, AAA games kind of waking up to the idea that people are open to not having their handheld. So, for example, Assassin's Creed Odyssey has that option where you can kind of turn off the HUD and turn off kind of the indicators and stuff. Do you think it is possible for a game to kind of cheat and be all things to all men like that successfully?
It's really interesting to see that go both ways. So you have that, and then you have like no enemies mode in things as well at the other end. And I think that's great for AAA. What they're trying to do is again like make the broadest experience they possibly can. So they're trying to aim for the biggest market they possibly can. I mean, we did some new things FS2, like an Iron Man mode that we haven't done before, to try and for people who really want to get that very very hardcore extreme tactical experience. And you've always been interested in easy modes and other ways of.
I have. I've always found it hard to get that. The biggest point I have about this is I always say to people, like, you should play when you're offered a difficulty mode in like an FPS, you should play medium, because that's the one the developers have spent the last 2 years working on. And the other two are things that they've put in an evening to try and have a that's the experience they wanted to give you. Now, it's possible that by doubling the health of all of the bad guys, you'll make a better game that some person enjoys more, but it's not very likely.
Yeah.
So, is it possible to do both? It feels... I really like Odyssey's approach of having the can't die mode. I think that there are lots of people who really, really enjoy that. In terms of making it harder, I would imagine it's only ever really like a slightly aesthetic thing, rather than something that would feel really satisfying. But I could be wrong about that.
I mean, you did mention there that you've added stuff to Frozen Synapse 2 as well, and you Ian said that you're going to be adding more as the kind of weeks and months go on. Can you talk a little bit about what you might be adding, or do you want to keep some stuff?
Well, we haven't fully decided yet, but we are looking at doing a lot more diplomacy with the other factions. I've always wanted to make a game where the factions vote. Like, it's something that I'm very excited about.
I want to do that, because that's the idea that keeps coming up, and we've got the structure to do it now. We've got to have some fun with this structure that we have. I mean, skirmish mode is one thing that we didn't have at launch, and that's just going straight in. Like, that'll be in
maybe next week.
Yes, maybe next week. Don't commit to dates, but that is definitely going in, 100% going in. And then we really want to look at the city, and I'm interested in. Like I was sort of talking about yesterday, just looking at what the community is saying a bit more and trying to figure out which of those bigger features that we could do in the city would work best and just provide the most sort of bang for buck in terms of our time. But yeah, something diplomacy, something economy related, that kind of area is where we're looking.
I need to take a week off because my brain is completely dead, and then I'll be able to start creatively thinking about what's going to work. I think.
Which is your favourite faction that you've got in the game at the moment?
It's got to be Diamond Brothers.
Diamond Brothers, the banking faction, gets the biggest reaction from some of their behaviour. I quite like Forgiven Geometry, who are the shape form faction, so they're kind of AIs. And one thing I put in at the last minute is the leader has an intangible, imaginary friend called the Companion Drobbit that he refers to constantly and will tell you that you've upset them at different times. And that was just fun to write. That was kind of me going insane from writing too much and just wanting to put something in where I could just make a silly reference to it all the time. So probably Forgiven Geometry.
Fair enough. I think we can open up to the audience now, see if anyone's got any questions, and I'll do my run down into the audience again like I did yesterday. That was fun. Does anyone have any questions? But come on.
Got to be one question.
There you go.
Yes.
So I'm going to piggyback on the whole difficulty topic again.
Sure.
Following on from what Alice was bringing up with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, how they've got both extremes. It's similar to Shadow of Tomb Raider as well, but sort of to another extent, where in the Shadow of Tomb Raider you can change the difficulty of certain things. So you can change the difficulty of combat, being it either easier or harder if you want to make it a harder thing to do, and same with puzzles. You can make it as easy as possible so that you can know how to solve all these puzzles, or just have no hints whatsoever. Is that something that you may have thought of doing with FS2, being able to change the difficulty of certain things rather than the difficulty of the game as a whole?
Well, one thing I'd like to do, if we can, is so that there was a file that I used to kind of balance the game, which includes things like how expensive things are and how frequently certain things happen. Finding a way to, in some kind of big-grained way, expose a little bit of that in city options would be really good.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to have the features on a stage.
Well, it's this fella's fault.
Well, okay, yes. But that kind of thing, I think I'd like a bit more customization for that kind of thing.
No, definitely. I like the idea of putting in Madden-style sliders for all of that. And I was thinking we could do
awesome.
Some of that stuff specifically for road missions or base attacks or incursions. We have several really quite different forms of missions.
Yeah.
And some people find road missions boring.
Yeah.
So you could always make them weird.
The price of units in the city game is one of the things that it was so hard to get right. And I think I think I managed to do it, but being able to change that and alter that sort of really changes the game. You have 5 squads of scope rifles running around. It's going to be a different game. So that would be a good lever.
Yeah.
Thanks. Sweet.
Does anyone else have any questions? Come on, this guy's been brave. Doesn't have to be about Frozen Synapse. Could be about other games.
Uh-oh.
No?
I suppose now Frozen Synapse 2 has been released. Is that what you envisioned it being when you sort of set out on that, or have you? So obviously the UI and the sort of setting is quite similar to the first one. Is that something that you sort of didn't want to change for the second one, or is that something you might look at for, say, Frozen Synapse 3?
It's pretty close to what we originally looked at. About as close as you can get with this kind of thing. And Frozen Synapse 3?
Yeah,
No idea.
Don't say that. I'm also surprised by sort of how close we managed to get to kind of what Ian was describing sort of in your brain when you first started thinking about it. It was to do a kind of modern, more complicated, more systemic XCOM apocalypse. And that's what the game feels like, certainly when I play it. I mean, there's definitely scope to do more. There's always scope to do more in something that's this broad. But I think we achieved what we were trying to achieve.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any more for any more? Come on, they're super interesting guys. No? I have a question.
All right.
What's your top tier biscuit? See, this is it. Yeah, see, thinking hard about this one.
I might go for like a Choco Leibniz.
Oh, those are good.
It's a hipster biscuit choice, somewhat.
But very good.
There's M&S ones that are more chocolate than biscuit.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well,
yeah,
you
like
know that where it's
the
like
round-
wrapped in the
Yeah,
the
definitely.
chocolate cocoon.
Not really technically a biscuit.
Yeah, just pushing the limits.
All right, thank you very much. Would everyone like to join me in thanking Ian and Paul from Mode 7 for being here today and giving a wonderful talk about the making of Frozen Synapse 2. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alice.
Thank you.